children, not per child. This is unique to in-home care. Places are kept at 3,000 and distributed across states and territories, just as they are now, with each place representing 35 hours of care per week per child. For example, where the child is eligible for 28 hours of care, they will be allocated 0.8 of a place. If they were eligible for 42 hours of care, they would be allocated 1.2 places. Places are only open to the following families: those living in geographically isolated areas, working non-standard or variable hours, such as shift work, and those with complex or challenging needs. To align with the National Quality Framework, educators will be required to have a minimum of Certificate 3 in early childhood education or be working towards a Certificate 3. New in-home care support agencies will be established to support families in each state and territory. This doesn't replace the service providers, but does provide an opportunity for an agency to broker for families' care. So let's look now at key legislative changes. Family assistance law is made up of primary legislation and subordinate legislation. So the Family Assistance Legislation Amendment Jobs for Families Childcare Package Act 2017 is what we call primary legislation. Beneath it, the subordinate legislation, Ministers' Rules and Secretaries' Rules sit. The difference between Ministers' Rules and Secretaries' Rules is who can make them, but also policy elements tend to sit with the Ministers' Rules, and the day-to-day administrative requirements and elements are generally in Secretaries' Rules. The rules set out the detail about how certain operational aspects of legislation will work in practice, what is included and what is excluded. For example, what activities are included under the new activity test. The department developed the rules based on feedback received through comprehensive national consultation with the sector over the last year or two. Updates will be available on an ongoing basis at the address on your screen. Under family assistance law, services are approved to operate for the purposes of administering childcare benefit and childcare rebate on behalf of eligible families at the moment. From 2 July, services will be approved to administer the childcare subsidy. How your approval will change is covered a bit later on in the sessions. There are some changes in family assistance law that you need to be aware of. The changes included in the legislation that was passed last year. Our focus today will be to take you through the sections that are changing. So, as we've already talked about, the ALE rate cap sets a limit on government subsidy and contribution. This will be indexed annually and will be used to calculate the maximum subsidy contribution together with family income and activity levels. New requirements to provide a service approval include strengthened fit and proper person requirements for personnel in key positions, including family daycare educators. As we've discussed, a new activity test will more closely align hours of subsidised care with the hours of activity. There are strengthened compliance capability, which we'll talk about in the Module 3. Changes to minimum operating hour requirements and service types, which we'll talk about shortly. All of this is outlined in the handbook on page 3, which I hope all of you have. So, operating requirements do change. We're removing minimum hours per day and days per week a service must operate. So from 2 July, you'll only be required to operate for a minimum of 48 weeks per year, or 7 weeks per year if the service only provides outside school hours care. Services will be able to determine for themselves the number of hours per day and days per week they wish to operate and provide care. They can also determine the lengths of sessions of care, that is, the period of time the provider is charging a fee for providing care to an enrolled child. Sessions of care should be flexible enough to cater for the needs of families. This should not be considered in any way a standard length for a session of care. So sessions of care, as you see, are unchanged, of up to a maximum of 12 hours. This, together with the removal of minimum operating hours, ensures providers have flexibility to offer sessions that meet the needs of families. In exceptional circumstances where 24-hour care is provided, it must be submitted as 2 or more sessions of care. We expect that smaller services or services operating in rural and remote communities will be particularly interested in these changes, as it allows them to respond more flexibly to their community needs. For example, if there's only demand for 3 days a week, then they'll have the capacity to open on those days and that work for them and their community. So family assistance law intends to align with provider and service approvals issued by your state or territory regulatory authority. You'll notice that I've been using the word provider here. It's important that the legal entity is the same for both the childcare subsidy approval and the national law approval. As a matter of law, we need to be certain that the entity being approved under family assistance law is the same as that approved under national law. For new services entering the market after the 1st of July, applicants will apply for provider and service approval using the new IT system. And here we're talking about new, not existing services. A childcare provider, its staff with management or control, and people with day-to-day responsibility of the service, and family daycare educators must be fit and proper persons to operate a childcare service and to administer childcare subsidy and additional childcare subsidy. Matters involving fraud, dishonesty or negligence can affect whether or not these people are fit and proper and are considered relevant in the decision about whether a provider or service is approved. To remain an approved provider, you must continue to operate at least one approved service. Because provider and service approvals are being aligned with national law, adding or removing a service from your provider approval should be simpler because you won't have to give information about the provider again. Applications to add or remove a service will be done through the new IT system when it comes on stream, the childcare subsidy system. So new childcare subsidy applicants will also need to provide documentary evidence in regard to checks made to assess the fitness and propriety of all people involved in childcare services. The number and type of checks reflect the level of involvement of the relevant person in the operation of the provider and or service. So as you can see on the screen, depending on the role you have, requires a different level of evidence. Okay, so we're happy to take questions. Okay, so Tracy has asked, will it be considered hours that families travel to and from activities as they will need more hours in care than they work? I think in the particular setup where we're talking about hours of care, they won't necessarily need more hours of care. But in the activity test, we're taking into account the fact that we're providing more hours than the hours of activity to enable people to actually do those types of things like travel to and from activities. Next question. Okay, you said a family can apply for more than 100 hours of care if they need. How do they apply? Thanks, Jackie, for that question.
Yes, so that process would be the family making an application under exceptional circumstances type provision through Centrelink, and they just need to outline the particular circumstances that the family's experiencing and to outline why they need additional hours of subsidised care per fortnight, so not dissimilar to the current situation.
So Danny has asked, will the hourly rate be different for school-aged children and non-school aged children? So if you go back to the slide that we had up earlier, Danny, you'll find that the answer to that is yes, they will be. So if people out there have their slide pack handy, we won't go backwards on the slide deck. You'll actually see in the table on that slide marked hourly rate caps that is the case. All right, so we don't have any more questions for just the moment, so we might move on And I'll hand over to Sam to talk about enrolments.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay, so I'm going to run through the enrolment process. There's some things that are, quite a few things that are similar to current arrangements and some areas where things are a little bit different. So I'll just run through those steps and have time for some questions at the end as well. So as you can see from the flowchart that's showing at the moment on the slide, the enrolment process involves obviously actions on behalf of the family, the childcare service, and also Centrelink, Department of Human Services. And there's essentially 4 steps involved in enrolling a child. Quite a few of those, as I said, are very similar to current arrangements, but I'll just run through and outline some